East is 20 minutes from London. On board, deep in discussion, are King Xenophon of Shampur and the Prince Serikit. Serikit says the king must not sign the treaty in London. It will incite civil war, but Xenophon refuses to compromise with the Tukshan, who plan to usurp him from power. A steward enters. Serikit's granddaughter, Mai Li, notices he has a gun. He draws it, but Serikit leaps at the gunman, causing him to miss his target. Serikit is himself hit, but not seriously, and General Truk, the king's head of security, restrains the steward. As the plane comes into land at London Airport, the king orders Truk to kill the assassin, and the man is thrown from the aircraft.
Kill the King, written by James Mitchell, produced by Leonard White, and directed by Roger Jenkins.
At the London suite reserved for King Xenophon's party, Steed meets Crichton Bull, a Foreign Office man. The royal entourage is due shortly, and Steed has arranged for Carol Wilson to attend to Prince Serikit's injuries as her employer, Dr. David Keel, is on duty at the hospital and cannot be called away. Crichton Bull stresses to Steed the importance of King Xenophon's visit. If the treaty goes unsigned, Britain will lose a significant Far Eastern oil concession. Steed is more concerned that the king should get out of the country alive. He has survived 5 assassination attempts in 3 years, and if the king is killed on his watch, Steed will find his employment terminated just as quickly. Carol is briefed by Crichton Bull about her patient's condition. The 3 proceed to the balcony to view the king's arrival. Meanwhile, a Major Harrington calls at the home of Mrs. Zoe Carter. He brings news of her husband, Tony, who went missing from Shampur a year ago and is believed dead. Harrington reveals that Carter is alive, a hostage of the Tukshan rebels. If he can stay for a few days, posing as a friend of her husband's, Tony will be freed, but if she doesn't play along, her husband's death is a certainty. She asks the Major what he plans.
You know, Mrs. Carter, I've shot a lot of big game out east, but this will be the first time I've had a pop at royalty. I'm going to kill a rich, brilliant man, a man I rather like, actually, and such an easy shot, too,
Harrington comments as he looks from Mrs. Carter's window to the balcony across the road. He lines up his sights on Steed, who stands there. On the balcony, Steed complains to Crichton Bull that the suite chosen is far from secure. The Shampur embassy insisted upon it, says Crichton Bull, so they will have to make the best of it. Steed is introduced to the king, who reveals he is under great pressure not to sign the treaty and fears for his life. Steed must protect him. The king will not be swayed from his intent by rebels. Carol enters with Prince Serikit, who has benefited from her treatment. The king is grateful to Carol for her dedication and skill. She is called away when Keel telephones from the hospital, where he is being kept busy in the maternity ward. She reports that the prince's wound was only slight, and that she was able to treat it with antiseptic, bandages, and a tetanus injection. Carol leaves for the surgery, and Steed remains with General Truk to question him about the incident on the flight to London. Truk believes that Serikit's brother, Prince Sadek, a Tukshan sympathiser, had ordered the assassination attempt. Steed confronts the general on a particular issue. "I can't help wondering what possessed you to dump that steward overboard without interrogating him first," says Steed. Meanwhile, Zoe Carter tells Harrington that she had left her husband and regrets the way she behaved. Crichton Bull visits them and inquires as to Harrington's identity. Mrs. Carter tells the Foreign Office official the story that Harrington had insisted upon. He is an old friend of her husband's. She can vouch for him. Crichton Bull is satisfied. Harrington's plan is falling into place. At his bookshop, Wu Meng and 2 other Shampur nationals, Tapai and Su Shong, discuss plans to overthrow King Xenophon. Su Shong will approach the king when he appears on the balcony.
"You will call out for him and hail him as the saviour of our country. You will then execute him for what he is, a murdering criminal," orders Wu Meng.
Crichton Bull tells Steed that he is not to worry about Harrington. He has worked with people like him for years, totally trustworthy. But Steed is not convinced. He telephones 110, who resolves to check Harrington's background with the Singapore office. Back at the bookshop, Su Shong has left. Wu Meng explains to Tapai that Su Shong will fail. The king is too well guarded, but once Su Shong has been arrested, he expects security to be scaled back, and then Wu Meng will carry out the execution of King Xenophon. In the king's suite, Steed learns that Xenophon has left for a London night spot. Prince Salakit reveals the king has a reputation with the ladies, and Xenophon proves this when he arrives with Ingrid Storm, a vivacious dancer, at his side. Leaving the others to discuss arrangements, Steed takes the opportunity to have a chat with Miss Storm and Mai Li. Ingrid shows Mai Li a charm that she claims the king gave her. Steed does not believe her and makes her tell the truth. She received it, along with £50, from a man called Wu Meng. In return, she was to ingratiate herself with the king and report back about security arrangements. Mai Li comments that in her language, Wu Meng translates as Mr. Nobody. Across the way, Major Harrington taunts Zoe. She asks if he can help her husband, but his response is evasive. The doorbell rings. It is Steed, following up on inquiries made earlier. Harrington confirms that he is a rubber planter based in Malaya and that he is visiting relatives in the north of England, stopping off first in London at Mrs. Carter's invitation. He hadn't met her before, but had messed together in India with her husband in 1943. Harrington claims never to have visited Shampur. Steed talks to Mrs. Carter privately and asks if Harrington has said anything of Tony Carter's demise. Fearing for her husband's safety, she lies that the Major has not spoken about him. Their discussion is interrupted. In the street below, students have begun a demonstration against the king. Xenophon has also heard the disturbance and strides to the balcony. There is the sound of a shot. Ingrid runs off. The gunman is captured. It is Su Shong, the man sent by Wu Meng. Having heard the shot, Steed dashes to the king's suite to investigate. He arrives and complains that the king should not have exposed himself to risk so carelessly. A better shot with a better gun and you'd be dead, warns Steed. Xenophon explains he must listen to the voice of his people. Steed insists that the king only goes out on the balcony with his express consent. Shortly afterwards, Steed receives a call from 110. He has no information on Harrington, but has ascertained that Tony Carter, a British agent, is definitely dead, executed by Tukshan rebels. Meanwhile, Wu Meng meets with Ingrid in her dressing room at the nightclub. She explains the security layout of the king's suite and reveals that she believes Steed has had her watched. Wu Meng decides it is time to act against Steed. He orders Ingrid to telephone Steed and lure him to the club. In her apartment, Zoe Carter asks Major Harrington about her husband. He last saw him 4 weeks ago. He was very thin but reasonably well. She asks how Tony was coping with his malaria. Harrington reassures her that the condition is under control. "But Tony never suffered from malaria," exclaims Zoe. "You never knew him. You've done nothing but lie since you stepped in this house. Tony is dead. They killed him," she says accusingly. Harrington concedes that she is quite correct. However, if she values her own life, she has little choice but to do as he says. But Crichton Bull later claims he was Ingrid's to deputise. Ingrid regains her composure and reveals that Wu Meng can be found at 127 Maxwell Street in Cheapside. She also asks if the charm that Steed had confiscated, depicting the Shampur crest sitting on the back of a jade elephant, will be returned to her. Crichton Bull is sure he has seen it somewhere else, but struggles to remember where. Wu Meng attempts to enter the king's suite, posing as a champagne waiter. He waves a pass and is allowed through. Steed follows and comments that the waiter is not on the king's regular staff. Wu Meng opens the champagne bottle and sprays the liquid in Steed's face. The pair fight. Steed gains the upper hand and eventually subdues Wu Meng. The king commends Steed for dealing with the attack so efficiently. Crichton Bull returns, having sent some men to find Prince Sadek in Cheapside. Steed is grateful, but expects the search to be fruitless, as he recalls the address is that of a maternity clinic. A servant enters and hands the charm, the good monkey, to Steed. Crichton Bull recognises it as the one Ingrid mentioned, but is sure he has seen it elsewhere. Steed insists It is vital Crichton Bull recalls this detail. "Who have you seen today?" Steed asks the Foreign Office man. "Only Mrs. Carter," he says. "Good Lord, it was the Major. It was a label on his case." Steed dashes to Mrs. Carter's flat, but is told that Harrington has left town to see relatives in the north. Steed leaves and Zoe closes the door. The Major walks up to her. She almost convinced him too. Steed races back to warn the King that there will be another attempt on his life. He believes it will occur tomorrow when the King makes his scheduled appearance on the balcony. Steed insists it be cancelled. The King reluctantly agrees. Steed reveals that later that night he intends to break into the flat opposite, where he means to deal with a sniper. In that flat, Harrington reveals to Zoe that his date is nearly over. He tells Mrs. Carter that if she is good, she can watch. Suddenly, there is a distinctive sound of an approaching helicopter. Major Harrington readies his rifle and brings his eye to the sight. "A helicopter," observes Harrington. "Fascinating things, helicopters. Quite a novelty. People still stop and look at them." "So that's how," says Zoe Carter, the realization dawning. "That's how," the Major responds coldly. The King has heard the approaching helicopter and wishes to see it. Crichton Bull protests and checks the balcony is safe. Harrington's gun sights focus upon the Foreign Office man. "Wrong fella," curses the Major. The King and Serikit make for the balcony. Crichton Bull tells Chook the King must be stopped. Chook declares that no one can touch the King's person, not even he himself. In desperation, Crichton Bull calls for Steed, who dashes to the balcony. Harrington takes aim. If only he can get a clear shot. His finger presses harder against the trigger. Steed bundles the King to the floor. A shot rings out, and Prince Serikit falls. Steed and the King scramble inside. Across the way, Harrington is preparing his getaway. Suddenly the door is thrown open and Chook barges in. He takes Harrington by surprise and shoots him dead. Meanwhile, in the King's suite, Prince Serikit lies dead. The King appears grief-stricken, but Steed has seen through him. He holds the King with a steely glare. "You and Chook had it all arranged. You hired Harrington when he was in Shampoor last year, and you had him kill Prince Serikit because he was a neutralist, a compromiser," Steed accuses. "He wanted you to let his brother Sardek in, but you knew that if that happened, the Tukshan would take the country from you. He was a good man, a saintly man. I loved him, but he had to die. In the end, I had no choice," says the King regretfully. Chook returns, and the King reveals to him that Steed has seen through their unpleasant scheme. But Steed's hands are tied. "There's nothing much I can do," Steed concedes. "You have your diplomatic immunity." Later, Steed meets with Keel on the balcony outside the King's suite. Keel has finished for the day at the hospital and has missed all the excitement. Looking out over the London night, Keel reflects on what he would have been doing on an evening like this before his fiancée Peggy was murdered. Steed asks him why he devotes so much time to fighting crime. Keel looks off into the night. He does not need to answer. Steed knows.
Betul dah,